I didn't make a scene. That's the part people still talk about, that I just stood there, perfectly still, while the room went silent around me. 64 years old, gray at the temples, hands that had driven nails into more wood than I could ever count, and I just looked at my daughter-in-law and said, very quietly, "No. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened that night. I am not a man who gives up easily. I built Hargrove Lumber and Supply from a single pickup truck and a handshake loan from a man named Earl Pitts, who believed in me when my own father told me I was wasting my time. I was 23 years old. I worked 6 days a week for the first 11 years. I missed birthday parties. I missed Little League games. I missed things I can never get back. And I have made my peace with that. Mostly, though some nights the weight of it still sits on my chest like a stone. My wife, Patricia, was the one who held everything together during those years. She kept the books when we couldn't afford an accountant. She drove my son David to school every single morning so I could be at the yard by 5:30. She planted a garden every spring because she said it was important for a child to watch something grow. She was the smartest person I ever knew. And she died 4 years ago this past March, and there is not a single day that I don't think about her. David was always a good boy. Soft-spoken, careful, the kind of kid who thought things through before he spoke. He got that from his mother. He came into the business after college, learned every position from the floor up the way I insisted, and by the time he was 35, he was running most of our daily operations. I was proud of him in a way I was never quite able to say out loud the way I should have, which is something I've had to sit with. He met Nicole at a conference in Atlanta. She was in commercial real estate, sharp and polished and full of a certain kind of energy that I recognize now as ambition wearing a social smile. At the time, I thought she was just confident. Patricia would have seen through it faster than I did. Patricia always could read a room better than anyone. They married 2 years after Patricia passed. I was happy for my son. I wanted him to have what I had, someone to build a life with, someone who would be there when the hard years came. I told myself that my unease about Nicole was grief looking for somewhere to land, and I tried to set it aside. The first year was fine. The second year, things started to shift in ways that were small enough that I could explain each one away individually. Nicole began sitting in on business meetings she had no role in. She started asking questions about the real estate holdings attached to the company we owned, the land under our main yard and 2 satellite locations, land that Patricia and I had bought parcel by parcel over 30 years. She asked about the valuation of the company in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like inventory. And she began, slowly and steadily, to work on my son. I don't say that lightly. I watched it happen, and I still can't tell you exactly how she did it, because it wasn't loud. It was 1,000 quiet conversations I wasn't in the room for. It was a gradual shift in the way David looked at me, not unkindly, but with a kind of careful distance, like a man who has been told to keep his feelings at arm's length. By the time I noticed it clearly, it had already been going on for a long time. She started calling Hargrove Lumber our business, not David's business, not the family business, our business, as in hers, as in something she had a claim to that I had never given her. My 65th birthday was in October. David planned a party at the Riverside Banquet Hall, a big room, round tables with white cloths, probably 80 people between family and longtime employees, and a few old friends from the community. Earl Pitts was there, 81 years old and still sharp as a tack. My foreman, Ray, had driven up from Knoxville. People who had known me since I was a young man, with nothing but a truck and a prayer. I want you to hold that image for a moment. 80 people. People who had worked beside me, trusted me, shown up for me in the ways that matter. My sister Carol from Cincinnati, my bookkeeper, Margaret, who had been with the company for 22 years. My son, who I loved more than I knew how to say. The dinner was good. There were speeches. Ray told a story about the time I drove a forklift through the wrong side of our first warehouse and he had laughed so hard he couldn't breathe. Earl stood up without being asked and said some things about me that I will carry to my grave. I felt full, the way you feel on the nights when life adds up right. Nicole did not speak during the toasts. She sat next to David with a small, fixed smile, and I noticed that she had a folder on the table beside her, which I thought was odd. And then I thought nothing more of it until after dessert. It was when the music started, and people began moving around the room that she did it. She waited, I think, for the exact moment when enough people were nearby to witness it, but the setting was still intimate enough that there was nowhere to go. She stood up and she said my name in a voice that was designed to carry. I looked up from a conversation with Earl. She was holding the folder. She said that she and David had been talking, and they felt that the time had come for a formal transition. She used those words, formal transition. She set the folder on the table in front of me and opened it to the first page, which was a legal document, a transfer of ownership agreement, prepared by someone, with my name typed at the signature line at the bottom. The room had gone quiet the way rooms do when they sense something wrong before they understand what it is. I looked at the document. I looked at my son. David was not looking at me. He was looking at the tablecloth, and his jaw was set in the way it gets when he has convinced himself that something is necessary. I said, "What is this?" Nicole said it was straightforward. She said I was 65 and it was time to enjoy my retirement, and David was ready to take full ownership. And this just made everything official and clean. She said it like she was doing me a favor. She said it in front of Earl Pitts and Ray and Margaret and my sister Carol and 75 other people who had come to celebrate my birthday. I said, "My son knows how to talk to me. He doesn't need you to speak for him." David finally looked up, and I saw something in his face that I hadn't expected. Not guilt, exactly, but something like it, wrapped in a layer of stubbornness that she had put there. He said, "Dad, we've discussed this. It makes sense." I closed the folder. I said, "I'm not signing anything tonight." Nicole's expression changed then. The polish came off, just slightly, and underneath it was something harder. She said, with that same carrying voice, that they had given me plenty of time and they weren't asking anymore. She said the business would be a lot easier to run without the complications of shared ownership, and they needed this resolved. I want you to understand how quiet the room was. I want you to understand that Earl Pitts was sitting 3 feet away, and Margaret was standing near the bar with her hand over her mouth, and my sister Carol had gone completely still. I said, "No, just that. One word." Nicole put her hand on the folder and slid it back toward me. She said my name again, slowly, and she said that I needed to think carefully about the position I was putting David in, and that this was going to happen one way or another, and tonight would be much simpler for everyone. I stood up. I am not a tall man, but I have worked with my hands for 40 years and I still stand like I mean it. And when I pushed back my chair and got to my feet, I saw something flicker in her eyes that I think was surprise. I picked up my napkin from my lap and set it on the table. I looked at my son, who was still not quite meeting my eyes, and I said, "David, when you're ready to talk to me like my son, I'll be outside." Then I walked out of the Riverside Banquet Hall, slowly, without looking back. The night air was cold the way October gets in Tennessee, sharp and clean, and I stood in the parking lot and I breathed it in for a minute. I could hear the muffled sound of the room behind me reorganizing itself, the low hum of 80 people processing what had just happened. I took out my phone. I called a man named Gerald Sutton. Gerald had been my attorney for 21 years. He was also, more importantly, the man who had helped Patricia and me structure the Hargrove family trust 8 years ago, when we started thinking seriously about what we wanted to leave behind and how we wanted to leave it. Gerald knew every detail of what Patricia and I had built, every decision we had made about the future, every intention we had put in writing. He answered on the second ring, because Gerald is that kind of man. I told him what had happened. I told him about the folder. I told him about the document with my name at the signature line. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tom, you didn't sign anything, did you?" I said, "Gerald, I've been doing business for 40 years. "No," he said. "All right. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I said, "It's my birthday party." He said, "I know. Happy birthday. I'll bring the trust documents." I put my phone in my pocket and I stood in the parking lot and I looked up at the Tennessee sky, which was clear and black and full of stars the way it gets when the weather is coming in from the west. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the first time we drove out to look at the land where we eventually built our main yard, how she had stood in the weeds and looked at the open space and said, "Thomas, I can see it." I thought about all the mornings we had sat at the kitchen table together when the company was young and fragile, going over numbers that didn't always add up, and how she had never once told me to quit. I thought about my son, and I felt something that was not anger. Exactly. It was closer to grief. The slow grief of watching someone you love make a choice you can't make for them. Ray came out about 10 minutes after I did. He didn't say anything. He just came and stood beside me and lit a cigarette, which he's been trying to quit for 15 years, and we stood there together looking at the parking lot. Finally, he said, "You okay, boss?" I said, "I'm fine. Give me one of those." He laughed, which was the right response. He said, "Your attorney is going to have a field day." I said, "He's already on his way." Ray looked at me. He said, "You saw this coming." I said, "Patricia saw it coming. I just listened." We went back inside after a while. The party had reorganized itself the way parties do after disruptions, clusters of conversation, lowered voices, the kind of careful social management that Americans do when they don't want to acknowledge that something uncomfortable has happened. Nicole was at the bar with a glass of wine, talking to someone I didn't recognize. David was sitting at our table alone, staring at his phone. Earl found me near the door. He gripped my arm with those old contractor's hands, and he said, "I've known you since you were a kid who didn't know what he was doing, and you always knew what you were doing. Don't let anyone tell you different." I said, "Thank you, Earl." He said, "Is that lawyer friend of yours coming?" I said, "Yes." He nodded. He said, "Good. I'd like to be here for that." Gerald arrived at 8:47. I know the exact time because I checked my watch when I saw him come through the door, briefcase in hand, tie slightly loosened the way it always is by evening. He is a lean, careful man in his late 50s who speaks slowly and says exactly what he means, which is a quality I have always appreciated in a lawyer and in a person. He shook my hand and said, "Where is she?" I pointed. He said, "And your son?" I pointed again. Gerald set his briefcase on an empty table near the back of the room and opened it. He took out a bound document about an inch thick and set it on the table. Then he looked around the room until he found Nicole, and he walked over to her. I followed, because it was my birthday and my company, and I had earned the right to be present. Gerald introduced himself to Nicole with the kind of professional pleasantness that contains no warmth at all. He said he understood she had presented a transfer of ownership agreement to Thomas Hargrove this evening. He said he wanted to make sure she had all the relevant information before that conversation went any further. Nicole looked at him with the careful eyes of someone recalculating. She said she had worked with attorneys herself, and she understood the documents she had prepared. Gerald said, "That's fine. What I want to make sure you understand is what you're working with." He picked up the bound document and handed it to her. He said, "The Hargrove Lumber and Supply business, along with the 3 parcels of real estate associated with it, have been held in the Hargrove Family Trust since the company's 32nd year of operation. The trust was established jointly by Thomas and Patricia Hargrove and was structured specifically to ensure that the assets pass according to the terms of the trust document, not through any separate transfer agreement." Nicole was flipping through the pages. Her expression was getting very still. Gerald continued. He said, "The terms of the trust, which Patricia Hargrove co-authored and signed, specify that the assets are to be managed by Thomas Hargrove during his lifetime, after which they pass to David Hargrove under a set of conditions that include the continuation of the company as an operating business for a minimum of 10 years. They do not transfer to spouses of beneficiaries. They cannot be sold or liquidated without the approval of the trust's appointed administrator." He paused. "That administrator is me." The room had gone quiet again. Not the entire room, most people were still in their own conversations, but the cluster of us near the back had the focused silence of people paying close attention. Nicole looked up from the document. Her face had the quality of a person doing very fast arithmetic and not liking the results. She said, "This can be contested." Gerald said, "It can be. Trust litigation takes an average of 2 to 4 years and is quite expensive." He said it pleasantly. The way you state a fact about the weather. She said, David is entitled to his inheritance. Gerald said, David is the beneficiary of this trust. His inheritance is protected. The trust ensures that. Nicole's voice rose slightly. She said, David's name should be on this company. He's been running it. Gerald said, David has an operational management agreement that provides him a salary and profit sharing. That is separate from ownership. Ownership is governed by the trust. He let that sit for a moment, and then he said, The document you asked Thomas to sign this evening would have had no legal effect on the trust assets, even if he had signed it, which he did not. I watched Nicole's face in the moment she understood that. I am not proud to say that there was some satisfaction in it. It was not a kind feeling, and I've examined it since, but it was real. What happened next is the thing I think about the most. David had come over while Gerald was speaking. He had been standing at the edge of the conversation, listening, and his face had gone through several changes that I tracked as carefully as I could. Confusion, and then a slow, uncomfortable realization, and then something that looked like shame. Nicole turned to him. She said, Did you know about this? David said, I knew about the trust. I didn't know all the details. She said, And you didn't tell me. He said, I didn't think it would come to this. Her voice got sharp then, in a way she had not let it get before. In front of people. She said, What does that mean? You didn't think what would come to this? David said, Nicole. Not here. She said, Your father has been stringing you along for years. You have put your whole life into this company, and he has structured everything so that you can't touch it without his permission. David looked at me then, and I saw something in his face that broke something open in my chest, because it wasn't the stubbornness I'd seen earlier in the evening. It was something younger. It was the face of a boy who has been told something about his father for long enough that he started to believe it, and who is standing in the moment of understanding that it wasn't true. He said, Dad, is that? I said, Son, your mother and I built that trust to protect you, not to keep you out, to make sure no one could take what we worked for out from under you. He was quiet. I said, Those conditions your lawyer just mentioned, the 10-year operating requirement, the no liquidation clause, your mother wrote those in, because she knew you'd be the one running it after I was gone, and she wanted to make sure it couldn't be sold off for parts. Earl Pitts, who had positioned himself nearby with the calm confidence of a man who has seen a great deal and is content to witness a little more, said, Patricia was a smart woman. Nobody argued with that. Nicole said something else then, about lawyers and trusts and what she called unfair structures, but her voice had lost its carrying quality. It had become a voice trying to hold a position that the ground had already shifted under, and the people in the room could hear the difference. David said, Nicole, stop. She looked at him. He said, Stop. It was the first time I had heard him say it with that kind of weight behind it. He said it the way a person says something they have needed to say for a long time and have finally run out of reasons not to. The room was very quiet. Nicole picked up her glass of wine. She set it back down. She picked up her purse. She walked to the table, picked up the folder with the unsigned documents in it, and walked out of the Riverside banquet hall. Several people watched her go. Nobody stopped her. David stood next to Gerald's briefcase for a long moment. He looked older than 38 in that light, which may have just been the hour. He looked at me and said, Dad, I'm sorry. I said, I know you are. He said, I didn't know she was going to. He stopped. He said, That's not. I knew she wanted to talk to you about the transition. I didn't know she was going to do it like that. I said, David, I need you to be honest with me. About what she told you. About what you believed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, She told me you'd built the trust in a way that kept control with you. That you didn't trust me to run the company without conditions. I said, That's not why. He said, I know that now. I said, I need to know you know it. Because that company has your mother's fingerprints all over it. And before I hand you the keys to it legitimately, the way I have always planned to, I need to know you understand what you're holding. He looked at me, and his jaw worked the way it does when he's trying not to cry. which he learned from me, and which I am not particularly proud of teaching him. He said, "She used to say it was a promise she was keeping." I said, "What?" He said, "Mom, she used to say the company was a promise she was keeping to you, and she wanted me to keep it after her." He stopped. He said, "I forgot that. I let myself forget that." I put my hand on my son's shoulder, the way I had not done in longer than I could account for, and I left it there. Gerald closed his briefcase with a soft click. He said, "Tom, I'll have the formal documentation ready for the transition review next week. When you're both ready." I said, "We'll call you Monday." Earl found us a few minutes later. He shook David's hand and then he patted his cheek the way old men sometimes do, without embarrassment, and he said, "Your father built something worth keeping, son. Make sure you keep it." We stayed until the end of the party. Ray got the band to play an extra set, and Margaret cried a little, quietly, near the dessert table, which she would deny if you asked her. My sister Carol sat with me for a long time and didn't say very much, which was exactly right. I want to tell you what I learned from all of it, not as a lesson with clean edges, but the way things actually get learned, which is slowly and incompletely and often later than you'd like. I learned that Patricia knew things about protecting the future that I hadn't fully given her credit for, even while I was watching her do it. I had been there for every conversation with Gerald, every decision about the trust, every line of that document, and I still had not understood it as completely as she had. She was not protecting it from David. She was protecting it for him. That distinction took me 4 years and one ugly evening to fully inhabit. I learned that my son had been more reachable than I thought, which meant I had also not been reaching hard enough. That's not a comfortable thing to carry, but I carry it because it's mine. I learned that Nicole, whatever else she was or wasn't, had miscalculated the thing that most people who reach for what isn't theirs miscalculate. She thought the only thing standing between her and what she wanted was a signature. She didn't understand that some things aren't protected by signatures at all. They're protected by 40 years of showing up, and by a woman who planted a garden every spring so a child could watch something grow, and by an old man named Earl, who loaned a 23-year-old kid money on a handshake because he believed in him. Those things don't transfer. You can't put them in a folder and slide them across a birthday table. They are already, permanently, somewhere else. David came to the yard the following Monday morning at 7 o'clock. He came the way he used to when he was learning the business early, before the crew arrived, coffee in hand, work boots on. I was in the office going over invoices, which is something I've done every Monday morning for 42 years, and I looked up when I heard the door, and there he was. He set a coffee on my desk. He sat down across from me. He said, "I'd like to start the transition review, if you're still willing." I said I was. He said, "I want to do it right, the way Mom would have wanted." I said, "She would have had opinions about the filing system." He laughed. It was the realest laugh I'd heard from him in years, unguarded and genuine, and it sounded like him again, the real him, the one that had been there before. I slid the first folder across the desk. I said, "All right, let's start at the beginning." Outside, the crew was arriving. I could hear Ray's voice in the yard, the sound of machinery starting up, the whole working morning assembling itself the way it does, reliably, the way it had been doing since before my son was born. The same sounds, the same rhythms, 42 years of them. Patricia used to say that a business is just a long argument you're making about what matters. You make it every day with your decisions and your choices, and the things you're willing to protect and the things you let go. Every morning you show up is another sentence in the argument. I looked at my son across the desk. He had his mother's eyes when he was concentrating, a particular quality of attention that I have always found steadying. I thought, we have more sentences to write. And I picked up my coffee, and we got to work.